I'd like to turn immediately to the equity side. In the presentations, we have, unfortunately, only time for what we call elevator speeches. Pretend this is an elevator. So, Pradeep, please, if you could start with the game-changing sort of thing that happened 3 months ago, and then talk about what you do and lessons for new players that might bring in private equity.
Sure. I can't tell whether this is on, but
it is.
On? Okay, good. So I think the key thing that has changed in the last few months, compared especially to the 2 previous years, I would summarize as China, commodities, and currency. And I think the point that I would make about that is that many people tend to do 2 things which I think are dangerous. One is that they look at emerging markets writ large as a giant category where everything is the same. And there are very large differences within emerging markets. Not everyone is structured like China. Not everyone is impacted equally by China. And I think the second thing that happens is that Africa is treated as a country rather than a continent with 54 odd countries, and I think at last count several thousand languages. So I think for people that are looking at it as an investment opportunity, and we've been doing that since 1993. We're a private equity investor. We've in the last decade invested in about 60 companies and exited about 28 of those, and remained pretty active. We have about $2 billion of exposure to Africa today. And really concentrated in Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa. I think the 4 or 5 points that I would make are that, one, for an investor, particularly in the private equity space, Africa is really 15 cities. It's not 54 countries, and even the 4 or 6 countries that people invest in, it's really 1 or 2 cities in those countries. That's where the opportunity set is. And those cities are very different from oftentimes the rest of their own countries. Typically, they make up 60% of the country's consumption, have per capita incomes that are 2.5 times the national average. And at the end of the day, when you're a private equity investor, you're buying a company. You're not investing in an entire country. The second thing is that different investment strategies have different risk profiles. So, oftentimes I think people take the risk profile of investing in the most dangerous mine in the most dangerous places in Africa and pretending like that's the same risk profile as buying an ice cream company in the most well-governed, most progressive markets on the continent, and they're just not the same. And you get very different exposures from the public markets, from the debt markets, and the private equity markets as well. The third thing I would say is that as a result, being local is absolutely critical. We're of the opinion that you can't fly in and out of these markets, and you can't even really cover sub-Saharan Africa from one place. I think you really have to be in at least 4. And then the last 2 points I would make. One is that you shouldn't judge what's happening in Africa by what's happening just to global business brands. In many of these markets, local brands are as competitive, if not more competitive, than multinational brands, which is why you see multinational brands often buying local brands. And part of the reason for that is that pricing strategy and cost structure is really critical in these markets. And a lot of the global brands are carrying a very large cost structure due to expatriate labor. And the pricing strategies are often leaning actually more to the upper middle segment rather than the mass market where the consumer opportunity often is. Finally, the one thing that everyone should be focused on and should be thinking very aggressively on how to manage is currency. We've seen a lot of these markets see depreciation in the tens of percentage points in the last 18 months. It's something that we pay a lot of attention to. I wish I could tell you a lot more about how we do that. But to the degree that people want to talk about that, we can talk about it after.
They'll be after the sessions here.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.